The Louisiana bayou stretched endlessly in all directions, its dark waters reflecting the gray morning sky like broken mirrors. Lieutenant Commander Sarah "Ghost" Mitchell adjusted her grip on her M4 carbine as she moved silently through the knee-deep swamp water. At 34, she had already earned a reputation that most Navy SEALs twice her age would envy. Her platinum blonde hair, almost white in certain light, was pulled back tightly under her tactical cap. The other members of her team had started calling her Ghost, not just because of her pale hair, but because of how she could disappear and reappear without a sound. The mission had seemed straightforward when they received the briefing 48 hours ago. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value target, arms dealer Victor Petrov, was using an abandoned oil drilling platform deep in the Louisiana swamps as his base of operations. Petrov had been selling military-grade weapons to terrorist organizations across 3 continents. The FBI had been tracking him for 2 years, but every time they got close, he vanished like smoke. Sarah's team consisted of 5 other elite operators. There was Chief Petty Officer Marcus "Tank" Rodriguez, a mountain of a man who could carry twice his weight in gear and still move like a cat. Petty Officer First Class David "Scope" Chun was their sniper, capable of hitting targets at distances that seemed impossible. Petty Officer Second Class James "Wire" Thompson handled all their electronic warfare needs, while Petty Officer Second Class Alex "Medic" Barnes kept them all breathing when things went sideways. Finally, there was Petty Officer Third Class Tommy "Rookie" Davis, the newest member of their team, eager to prove himself on his first major operation. The team had been inserted by helicopter 20 miles from the target location. The plan was simple: move through the swamp under cover of darkness, establish surveillance on the platform, and wait for backup teams to arrive before launching the assault. But plans rarely survived first contact with reality, especially in terrain as unpredictable as the Louisiana bayou. They had been moving for 6 hours when Wire's communication equipment started acting up. The swamp seemed to interfere with their radio signals in ways their intelligence briefings had not prepared them for. The water was deeper than expected, and the paths through the cypress trees that had shown up on their satellite images were either blocked by fallen logs or had disappeared entirely under the rising water level. Sarah raised her hand, signaling for the team to halt. She could hear something in the distance that did not belong in the natural soundscape of the swamp. It was too regular, too mechanical. Through her binoculars, she could see smoke rising from what appeared to be the oil platform, still 3 miles away through the twisted maze of waterways and vegetation. "Contact ahead," she whispered into her throat microphone. "Multiple heat signatures on thermal. Looks like we have more company than intelligence suggested." Scope moved to a position where he could get a better view through his rifle scope. After several minutes of observation, he reported back. "I count at least 20 hostiles, boss. They have sentries posted at regular intervals around the platform. This is not just Petrov and a few bodyguards. This looks like a full military operation." The original plan had called for a team of 12 SEALs to assault the platform once Sarah's reconnaissance team had gathered intelligence. But their backup was still 18 hours away, and something about the activity on the platform suggested that waiting might not be an option. Wire managed to get a brief communication through to command before his equipment failed completely. The message was fragmented, but the response was clear. The team was on their own until backup could arrive. Weather conditions had grounded all air support, and the nearest friendly forces were too far away to provide immediate assistance. As they moved closer to the platform, the terrain became even more challenging. The water was now chest-deep in places, and the cypress trees grew so close together that they had to move single file along narrow channels. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of decay, and clouds of mosquitoes swarmed around them despite their insect repellent. It was Tank who first noticed that they were being watched. His years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about the way the birds had gone quiet in a particular section of swamp made him uneasy. He signaled to Sarah, who immediately called for the team to take defensive positions. They waited in silence for 10 minutes, but nothing happened. The natural sounds of the swamp gradually returned, and Sarah was beginning to think that Tank's instincts had been wrong for once. Then, Rookie stepped on something that was definitely not a log or a rock. The explosive device had been carefully concealed underwater, probably placed there within the last few hours. The blast threw Rookie backward into a cypress tree, and the sound echoed across the swamp like thunder. Sarah's ears were ringing, but her training kicked in immediately. The platform was now aware of their presence, and they had lost the element of surprise. But worse than losing surprise was the realization that someone had known they were coming. The explosive had been placed along the most logical route to the platform, in exactly the spot where a reconnaissance team would be likely to pass. This was not random security. This was a trap. Medic was already working on Rookie, who was conscious but badly shaken. His left leg was injured, but not broken. More importantly, he could still fight if necessary. Sarah's mind raced through their options. They could try to withdraw and wait for backup, but moving an injured man through the swamp would be slow and dangerous. They could call for immediate extraction, but that would mean abandoning the mission and allowing Petrov to escape once again. The decision was made for them when Scope reported movement in the trees around their position. At least 6 armed figures were moving to surround them, and more were probably on the way. The team was trapped in an area of swamp with limited cover and no easy escape routes. Sarah checked her ammunition and weapon systems one more time. Her team had been in difficult situations before, but this felt different. The enemy was too well prepared, too well informed about their capabilities and tactics. Someone had betrayed their mission, and now they were fighting for their lives in terrain that favored the defenders. The first shots came from 3 different directions simultaneously. Sarah's team responded with the precision and coordination that had made them one of the most effective SEAL units in the Navy. Tank laid down suppressing fire, while Scope looked for targets of opportunity. Wire worked frantically to restore their communications, and Medic continued to treat Rookie while keeping his own weapon ready. But Sarah could see that they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The enemy fighters moved through the swamp with the confidence of people who knew every channel and hiding spot. They used the terrain expertly, appearing long enough to fire a few shots before disappearing back into the maze of trees and water. The firefight continued for 20 minutes before Sarah realized that their ammunition was running dangerously low. They had expected to be resupplied by backup forces, not to fight a prolonged battle with only the ammunition they could carry. If this continued much longer, they would be forced to engage in hand-to-hand combat in terrain where the enemy had every advantage. It was then that Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of the mission. Instead of waiting for the enemy to close in on their position, she would take the fight to them. Her white hair might make her stand out in some environments, but in the shadows and mist of the swamp, she could use it to her advantage. The enemy would expect a group of SEALs to fight as a unit. They would not expect a single operator to break away and begin hunting them individually. She signaled to Tank to take command of the defensive position, then slipped away into the dark water without a sound. Her teammates watched her pale hair disappear into the mist, and, for a moment, even they were not sure which direction she had gone. The ghost was doing what she did best, becoming invisible until it was time to strike. The swamp that had seemed like a prison just minutes before now became her hunting ground. Sarah had grown up in the wetlands of Florida, and she understood how to read the subtle signs that most people missed. She could tell which way the water was flowing by watching floating debris, and she knew how to move through thick vegetation without making a sound. Her first target was a sniper who had positioned himself in a cypress tree about 200 meters from her team's position. He was good at concealment, but he had made the mistake of choosing a position with only one way down. Sarah approached from behind, moving through water so slowly that she barely created ripples. The climb up the tree was the most dangerous part. For 30 seconds, she would be completely exposed if anyone happened to look in her direction. But the enemy fighters were focused on the ongoing firefight, and none of them noticed the pale figure ascending through the Spanish moss and twisted branches. The sniper never knew what hit him. One moment he was lining up a shot on Tank's position, and the next moment Sarah's knife had found the gap between his body armor and his helmet. She took his rifle and ammunition, then used his radio to listen to the enemy communications. What she heard made her blood run cold. The enemy fighters were not just random mercenaries hired by Petrov. They were speaking in Russian, Their tactical coordination was too professional, too precise. These were Spetsnaz operatives, Russian special forces who were among the best soldiers in the world. Even worse, she learned that this was not just about capturing or killing her team. The Russians were using this operation as a test of a new type of warfare, designed to neutralize small special operations units in difficult terrain. Her team had not just stumbled into a trap, they had become unwilling participants in a training exercise for enemy forces. But Sarah had spent her entire adult life preparing for exactly this kind of situation. The Russians might be skilled, but they were fighting on American soil, in an environment that she understood better than they did. And they had made one critical mistake. They had assumed that a single SEAL operator, no matter how skilled, could not pose a significant threat to a full squad of Spetsnaz soldiers. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Sarah studied the tactical radio she had taken from the dead sniper, listening carefully to the Russian communications. Her years of intelligence training had included extensive language study, and she could understand enough to piece together their battle plan. The Spetsnaz team had divided into 3 groups. One was keeping her teammates pinned down, another was moving to flank them from the east, and the third was preparing to assault their position from the north. But there was something else in the radio chatter that caught her attention. The Russians were reporting to someone called Volkov, and they were discussing timeline pressures. Apparently, this training exercise had to be completed before dawn, when American reconnaissance satellites would pass over the area. That gave her team less than 4 hours, but it also meant the enemy was operating under pressure. Sarah moved through the swamp like a predator, using every technique she had learned in 2 decades of special operations. She had always been small for a Navy SEAL, standing just 5 feet 6 inches tall, but that size advantage allowed her to move through spaces where larger operators would be spotted immediately. Her pale hair, which might have been a disadvantage in other environments, blended perfectly with the Spanish moss that hung from every tree. The second target was easier than the first. One of the Russian flanking teams had split up to cover more ground, leaving a communications specialist alone near what had once been an old hunting blind. The man was so focused on his equipment that he never heard Sarah approach through the water. She used her suppressed sidearm this time, a single shot to the head that dropped him instantly. But as she searched his equipment, Sarah discovered something that changed everything. The Russians' GPS unit showed not just the positions of her own team, but also the locations of 3 other American Special Operations units that were supposedly conducting training exercises in different parts of Louisiana. The Russians were not just testing their tactics against one SEAL team. They were preparing to eliminate multiple American Special Forces units simultaneously. This was not a training exercise. This was the opening move in a much larger operation, possibly the beginning of an actual military conflict. Sarah realized that her team's survival might be less important than getting this intelligence back to American command. She tried to use the Russians' radio equipment to contact her own command, but the frequencies were all wrong, and she did not have the encryption codes. Instead, she settled for gathering as much intelligence as possible from the dead operatives' gear. What she found painted a terrifying picture. The Russians had detailed information about American special operations procedures, equipment, and even personnel files. Someone with very high-level access had been feeding information to enemy intelligence for months, maybe years. The betrayal went much deeper than just this one mission. But Sarah's immediate problem was keeping her team alive long enough to report what she had discovered. The Russian commander, Volkov, was becoming increasingly frustrated with his men's inability to eliminate 6 American operators. According to the radio chatter, he was preparing to bring his reserve team into the fight. Sarah moved toward the sound of gunfire, where her teammates were still holding their defensive position. The firefight had become a stalemate, with both sides conserving ammunition and looking for opportunities to gain advantage. But she could see that Tank and the others were running low on supplies, and Rookie's injury was slowing them down. Her third target was the most dangerous yet. A Spetsnaz machine gunner had set up a position that was keeping her entire team pinned down behind inadequate cover. He was too far away for her to approach directly, and his position was well protected from multiple angles. But Sarah had noticed something about the old oil drilling equipment scattered throughout the swamp. Many of the metal structures were still connected to the main platform by a network of pipes and cables that ran just beneath the water surface. The system had been abandoned for decades, but the metal infrastructure was still intact. If she could follow those pipes, she might be able to approach the machine gunner's position from an unexpected direction. The underwater approach took nearly an hour, moving slowly to avoid creating disturbances on the surface. Sarah had to hold her breath for long periods while navigating around underwater obstacles, and more than once she nearly became entangled in the rusted cable systems. But the effort paid off when she emerged from the water directly behind the machine gunner's position. The Russian was good, but he had made the classic mistake of focusing too much on his primary field of fire. He had excellent cover from frontal assault, but he had not prepared for an attack from behind. Sarah's knife work was quick and silent, and within seconds she had control of a heavy machine gun with plenty of ammunition. But instead of immediately opening fire on the enemy positions, Sarah had a better idea. She used the machine gun to create a diversion, firing into the air and then quickly moving to a new position. The other Russian fighters naturally assumed that one of their own was providing covering fire, and several of them moved out of concealment to advance on her teammate's position. That was exactly what Scope had been waiting for. The SEAL sniper had been conserving his ammunition, but now he had clear shots at multiple targets. Within 30 seconds, he had eliminated 3 Russian operatives who had exposed themselves during their advance. The tide of the battle was beginning to turn, but Sarah knew that the most dangerous part was still ahead. Volkov was too experienced to let his remaining men be picked off one by one. According to the radio intercepts, he was pulling his forces back to a more defensible position while calling for reinforcements from the main platform. Sarah realized that she had to reach Volkov before he could escape or bring additional forces into the fight. The Russian commander represented not just a military threat, but also a crucial intelligence asset. If she could capture him alive, the information he possessed about Russian operations against American special forces could prevent a much larger catastrophe. But reaching Volkov would mean leaving her teammates to fend for themselves while she pursued a single target through hostile territory. It was exactly the kind of decision that separated exceptional operators from merely good ones. Sometimes the mission required individual sacrifice for the greater good. She made her choice and began moving toward the main platform, following the network of pipes and abandoned equipment that connected the smaller fighting positions to the larger structure. The platform loomed ahead of her through the mist, its rusted metal towers reaching up into the gray sky like the skeleton of some prehistoric monster. As she got closer, Sarah could see that the platform was much more active than their intelligence reports had suggested. There were at least 30 additional personnel moving around the structure, and several boats were tied up at what had once been a loading dock. This was not just a hideout for an arms dealer. It was a major staging area for Russian operations. The 4th Russian she eliminated was a sentry who had been posted to watch the water approaches to the platform. He was alert and well-positioned, but Sarah had the advantage of knowing exactly where he would be looking. She approached from an angle that kept her in his blind spot, using a partially submerged oil barrel as cover for the final approach. This time she used a different technique, one that would send a psychological message to the other defenders. Instead of killing the sentry quietly, she made it look like an accident. The man simply disappeared from his post, leaving his weapon and radio behind. When his body was eventually found floating in the water, it would look like he had slipped and drowned. But as Sarah climbed onto the platform itself, she realized that she had walked into an even more complex situation than she had imagined. The structure was not just occupied by Russian special forces. There were also civilian technicians working on sophisticated electronic equipment. Whatever operation was being planned here, it involved much more than just eliminating a few American Special Forces teams. She moved through the shadows beneath the platform, listening to conversations and observing the activity above. What she learned made her understand the true scope of the threat her country was facing. The Russians were not just testing tactics against American Special Forces. They were preparing to launch a coordinated cyber attack against American military communications systems. The timing was not coincidental. While Russian Special Forces eliminated American rapid response teams in the field, cyber warfare specialists would cripple the command and control systems that coordinated military responses to threats. It was a sophisticated plan that could potentially neutralize American military capabilities for hours or even days. Sarah knew that she had to stop this operation, but she was one person against dozens of enemies in a fortified position. Her teammates were still fighting for their lives miles away in the swamp, and no backup was coming anytime soon. The success or failure of preventing a potential military disaster now rested entirely on her shoulders. But as she studied the platform's layout and defenses, Sarah began to formulate a plan that was so audacious it might actually work. The Russians had made one crucial mistake. They had concentrated all their critical personnel and equipment in one location. If she could create enough chaos and confusion, she might be able to disrupt their entire operation. The key was the platform's old infrastructure. The facility had been built decades ago when safety regulations were less strict, and much of the original equipment was still in place. Sarah had noticed several large fuel storage tanks, along with electrical systems that looked like they had not been properly maintained in years. If she could create the right kind of accident, the resulting explosion and fire would not only eliminate the immediate threat, but also destroy the intelligence equipment that the Russians were using to coordinate their larger operation. The risk was enormous. She would likely not survive the explosion, but the alternative was allowing an attack that could cost hundreds or thousands of American lives. As Sarah prepared for what might be her final mission, she thought about the teammates she was leaving behind in the swamp. Tank, Scope, Wire, Medic, and Rookie were good soldiers and better friends. They would understand why she had made this choice, even if they would never forgive her for making it without consulting them. She checked her remaining explosives and began moving toward the fuel storage area, staying in the shadows and avoiding the patrols that moved regularly around the platform. The Ghost was about to disappear one final time, but this time she would take her enemies with her. As Sarah moved through the shadows beneath the platform, she intercepted another radio communication that changed everything. Volkov was not just coordinating the attack on American Special Forces teams. He was also receiving real-time intelligence updates from someone called Eagle, who was clearly an American asset feeding information to the Russians. The betrayal was happening at the highest levels of American military intelligence, and Sarah realized that even if she managed to stop this immediate operation, the larger threat would continue unless she could identify and eliminate the traitor. But first, she had to survive long enough to gather that intelligence. Her fifth target was a Russian communications specialist who had been left alone in an equipment shed while his colleagues prepared for the final assault on her teammates. Sarah needed access to his encrypted communication system to trace the source of the intelligence leaks. The specialist was young and inexperienced, probably brought along more for his technical skills than his combat abilities. Sarah approached from above, dropping silently from the platform's superstructure onto the roof of the shed. The metal was rusted and unstable, but her years of training had taught her how to distribute her weight to avoid making noise. She cut through the thin roof material with her combat knife and dropped into the shed behind the unsuspecting technician. This time she could not afford to simply eliminate her target. She needed information, which meant she had to take him alive and force him to cooperate. Sarah's interrogation training had taught her that the most effective techniques were psychological rather than physical, especially when time was limited. She pressed her knife to the young Russian's throat while covering his mouth to prevent him from calling for help. In fluent Russian, she explained exactly what would happen to him if he did not cooperate. The terror in his eyes told her that he believed every word she said. Within minutes, she had access to the Russian communication network and was tracing the source of the intelligence leaks. What she discovered was even worse than she had feared. Eagle was not just one traitor, but an entire cell of American intelligence personnel who had been compromised by Russian operatives over a period of several years. The conspiracy reached into the highest levels of the Pentagon, the CIA, and even the National Security Council. The attack on American Special Forces teams was just the beginning of a much larger operation designed to neutralize American rapid response capabilities before a major Russian military action. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. According to the intercepted communications, the final phase of the Russian operation was scheduled to begin in less than 2 hours. While American attention was focused on the Special Forces teams being eliminated in Louisiana, Russian submarines were preparing to launch a coordinated attack on American naval installations along the Gulf Coast. Sarah realized that her small team had accidentally stumbled into the opening moves of what could become World War III. The information she had gathered was too important to risk losing in a suicide attack on the platform. She had to find a way to get this intelligence back to American command while also stopping the immediate threat to her teammates. She forced the Russian technician to send a coded message through his own communication system, a message that would appear to be routine traffic but would actually contain the coordinates and timing information for the submarine attack. If American intelligence was competent, they would be able to decode the message and prepare appropriate countermeasures. But even as she worked to expose the larger conspiracy, Sarah could hear the sounds of battle intensifying from the direction where she had left her teammates. Tank and the others were running out of time, and she was the only one in position to help them. Her decision was made for her when Volkov himself appeared in the doorway of the equipment shed. The Russian commander was smaller than she had expected, but there was something in his eyes that marked him as one of the most dangerous men she had ever encountered. He held an automatic weapon casually, as if he had been expecting to find her there. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell," he said in lightly accented English. "Your reputation is well-deserved. My men have been telling me about the ghost who has been hunting them through the swamp." Sarah kept her knife at the technician's throat while facing Volkov. "Your men should have stayed in Russia," she replied. Volkov smiled coldly. "Russia is wherever Russian soldiers choose to make it. Your country has forgotten that the Cold War never really ended. It just became more subtle. Today we remind you that American military superiority is an illusion. The only illusion here is your belief that you'll survive the next 10 minutes, Sarah said. The standoff lasted for several seconds, with both operators evaluating their options and looking for opportunities to gain advantage. Sarah had the technician as a human shield, but Volkov had superior firepower and backup nearby. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge. It was the technician who tipped the balance. In his terror, he tried to break free from Sarah's grip and run toward Volkov for protection. The sudden movement gave Sarah the opening she needed. She threw her knife with lethal accuracy while simultaneously diving behind a bank of electronic equipment. Volkov was fast enough to avoid the knife, but not fast enough to prevent Sarah from disappearing into the maze of equipment and cables that filled the shed. For several minutes, the two elite operators played a deadly game of cat and mouse among the shadows and machinery. Sarah's advantage was her knowledge of the platform's layout, which she had been studying since she arrived. She knew where every piece of equipment was located, which cables carried electrical current, and which structural elements were strong enough to support her weight. Volkov had superior firepower, but he was fighting on unfamiliar ground. The end came suddenly. Sarah had positioned herself above a bank of electrical transformers when Volkov moved beneath her position. Her drop attack was perfectly timed, landing on the Russian commander before he could bring his weapon to bear. The struggle was brief but vicious, with both fighters using every technique they had learned in decades of combat training. But Sarah had one advantage that Volkov had not anticipated. Her smaller size allowed her to use leverage and momentum in ways that a larger opponent could not counter. When the fight ended, Volkov was unconscious and secured with his own equipment, while Sarah had control of both his weapons and his communication gear. The intelligence she gathered from Volkov's personal communications was the final piece of the puzzle. Not only did she now have complete details about the submarine attack and the American intelligence cell that was supporting it, but she also had the codes needed to contact American command directly. Her radio call to the Pentagon was brief and urgent. Within minutes, she had transmitted the locations of the Russian submarines, the timing of their planned attack, and the identities of the American intelligence personnel who had been compromised. The response was immediate. American naval forces were scrambling to intercept the submarines, and FBI teams were moving to arrest the traitors. But Sarah's immediate priority was still her teammates, who continued to fight for their lives in the swamp. She commandeered one of the Russian boats and loaded it with weapons and ammunition from the platform's stores. If her team was going to survive the next few hours, they would need all the help she could provide. The trip back through the swamp took less than 30 minutes, but it felt like hours as Sarah listened to the ongoing firefight over the radio. Her teammates were down to their last magazines of ammunition, and Russian reinforcements were closing in on their position from multiple directions. Sarah's arrival changed the dynamics of the battle immediately. She came in fast and loud, using the boat's mounted machine gun to sweep the enemy positions while her teammates moved to more defensible ground. The Russians had not expected to face an assault from the water, and their carefully planned encirclement collapsed in the face of Sarah's unexpected attack. But the fight was far from over. The remaining Russian forces were professional soldiers who adapted quickly to changing circumstances. They pulled back to regroup while calling for additional support from the platform. Sarah knew that she had only bought her team a temporary reprieve. The final phase of the battle was the most intense yet. Sarah and her teammates found themselves fighting back-to-back as Russian forces attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. Ammunition was running critically low, and several team members had been wounded during the prolonged engagement. It was Tank who came up with the plan that ultimately saved them all. The big sergeant had noticed that the rising water level in the swamp was causing some of the older cypress trees to become unstable. If they could bring down several large trees in the right locations, they could create barriers that would channel the Russian attack into predetermined killing zones. The plan required precise timing and perfect coordination, but Sarah's team had worked together long enough to execute complex maneuvers under pressure. Using their remaining explosives, they brought down a series of massive trees that created natural fortifications while limiting the Russians' mobility. The tide of battle turned decisively when American air support finally arrived. The weather conditions had cleared enough to allow helicopter gunships to reach their location, and the Russian forces found themselves caught in the open with nowhere to hide. The combination of aerial firepower and the SEALs' precise ground assault eliminated the remaining enemy forces within minutes. As the dust settled and the immediate danger passed, Sarah's teammates gathered around her with expressions of amazement and respect. They had all heard the radio communications during the final assault, and they understood that their commander had not just saved their lives but had also prevented a much larger catastrophe. "Ghost," Tank said with a grin, "remind me never to get on your bad side." Sarah looked at her teammates, all of whom were still alive despite everything they had been through. Rookie's injury was serious, but not life-threatening, and the rest of them had only minor wounds. Against all odds, the mission had been successful. But as she watched the helicopter gunships disappearing into the distance, Sarah knew that this victory was just the beginning of a much longer conflict. The Russian operation had been exposed and defeated, but the forces behind it were still out there, planning new attacks and looking for new weaknesses to exploit. The Ghost would be ready for them. She always was. 3 days later, Sarah sat in a secure briefing room at the Pentagon, providing detailed testimony about the events in the Louisiana swamp. The intelligence she had gathered had led to the arrest of 17 American intelligence personnel and had prevented what could have been the most devastating surprise attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. The Russian submarines had been intercepted and forced to surface by American naval forces. The international incident had been contained through diplomatic channels, with both sides agreeing to treat the events as a training exercise gone wrong, rather than an act of war. But Sarah knew that the real war was just beginning. The Russians would be back with new tactics and new allies. The next time, they might be more successful at concealing their intentions and eliminating American rapid response capabilities. As she prepared to rejoin her team for their next mission, Sarah reflected on the lessons learned during those desperate hours in the swamp. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not by large armies, but by small groups of dedicated individuals who refused to surrender when everything seemed hopeless. The Ghost was ready for whatever came next. Her teammates were counting on her, and she had never let them down. She never would. The swamp had tested them all, but it had also proven that even the most sophisticated enemy plans could be defeated by American soldiers who possessed the skill, courage, and determination to fight against impossible odds. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell and Her SEAL team had reminded the world why American Special Forces were still the most feared warriors on the planet. The white-haired killer had vanished back into the shadows, but her legend would live on in the stories that other operators would tell for years to come. In the dangerous world of special operations, there were soldiers, there were heroes, and then there was the ghost.